Hello and welcome. My name is Lauren Zehyoue, and I want to welcome you to the second season of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. For season 2, we are chronicling the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. But before we can even get started on the incoming administration, the actions of January 6th have made clear the issue is more than just the outgoing president. White supremacy has been an intentional key element of Republican politics for decades, but has really been thrust into the spotlight under President Trump. The most recent actions at the Capitol are just a culmination of various factions being tolerated and placated. My two guests today have done a great deal of research on white supremacy in America and the impact it's had historically on our politics and our faith. Dr. Kristopher Norris is a scholar of Christian ethics and political theology. His research focuses on race, politics, and moral formation in the Christian community. He currently serves as the Kreistler Visiting Professor of Ethics at Virginia Theological Seminary and is the author of Witnessing Whiteness, Confronting White Supremacy in America's Churches, released this past summer with Oxford University Press. He completed his PhD from the University of Virginia in 2017 in religious studies and holds master's degrees from Candler School of Theology at Emory University and from Duke Divinity School. Originally from North Carolina, he currently lives in Washington, D.C. and is a member of Calvary Baptist Church. He spent the last month of Christmas break playing Barbies, dance contests, and monster trucks with his niece and nephew. We also have with us today Reverend Zehyoue, who is no stranger to Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. Originally from Monrovia, Liberia, and raised in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Elijah has had a passion for history from a young age. He graduated from Morehouse College with a BA in history and went on to receive his master's in divinity from the University of Chicago. He's currently an associate pastor at Calvary Baptist Church and is a PhD student at Howard University. I'd like to welcome to the show Reverend Zehyoue and Dr. Kristopher Norris. Hello to you both.
Hey, Lauren, thanks for having us.
Hey, good morning, Lauren. Thanks for having us.
It's good to be here. So I guess we can kick it off. Reverend Zehyoue, if you want to give a bit of your background and how you got here, and then we'll follow up with Chris.
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me, Lauren. My name is Elijah Zehyoue. I am a minister and a historian. I did my undergraduate in history at Morehouse College, studied at the University of Chicago Divinity School for my master's, and now I'm pursuing a PhD in African and African American history at Howard University. It's just a great honor to get to be here and to get to talk about, one of my passions, right, which is the history of race. And of course, how white supremacy shows up as a part of that.
We're excited to have you. And Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I grew up in North Carolina, attended the University of North Carolina, and then received my MDiv from Duke Divinity School. I got another master's from Candler, so kind of traveling all around to schools in the South, and finished with a PhD in religious studies from the University of Virginia. During part of that time, I also was ordained as a Baptist pastor. I grew up Southern Baptist, so in the kind of evangelical conservative circles that we're going to be talking about today, and pastored a church for a little over a year in rural North Carolina. So have that sort of background and experience before kind of moving into the academic area after that. I'm currently teaching at Virginia Theological Seminary and attend church in Washington, D.C. at Calvary Baptist. So Elijah is one of my pastors. So we're going to be kind of renewing some conversations that we've had over the last several years here, I think also. So I'm excited about that.
That sounds good. And I imagine this conversation has been had a time or two, definitely. But kind of in shifting to our larger conversation, like we saw a lot of different signs and markers of the people who were at the Capitol on January 6th, right? We saw "Don't Tread on Me." We saw Confederate flags. We saw thin blue line flags as they were being very aggressive with police officers. But what struck out to me was the Jesus Saves signs that people had as well. And we've heard this rhetoric as this being an act of patriotism, maybe even an act of faith, depending on the church you come from. And so I wanted to talk about how all of these organizations and groups come together, and well, not even organizations, but ideologies kind of all are empowered by white supremacy and what it ends up looking like. And so we'll start with you, Chris, as far as what you thought when you saw those signs in particular together doing something like storming the Capitol.
Yeah, at this point, a couple weeks after that attack on the Capitol, we've sort of been inundated with a lot of these images and had time to sit and reflect on everything that we've seen. And so along with the sort of horrendous anti-Semitic shirts and logos, and a lot of those representing white supremacists, explicitly white supremacist groups like the Proud Boys. As you mentioned, Lauren, we also saw plenty of Christian symbols. So a flag that said Jesus saves, another one that said Jesus 2020, a Christian flag, which some people may be familiar with. And I've even heard reports of contemporary Christian music kind of being played and blaring as people rushed to the Capitol. It makes me think in a sort of sinister type way that if this was like a Quentin Tarantino film where they kind of have these montages of bad things happening with like music that just doesn't quite fit, that there's these people rushing the Capitol with "Lord, I lift your name on high" being played like in the background or something. The difference is this is real life where this is happening. And then even just yesterday, for the first time for me, I saw the new footage of that QAnon shaman, the guy with the horns, offering a kind of Christian prayer from the floor of the Senate after they had broken in there. So yeah, these symbols were all around there. In terms of your question of how they sort of came together, I mean, at its most sort of fundamental, I think that this is an alliance of resentment, is the way I would have to put it. That in the end, all of this comes back to whatever specific group people were there, what their specific motivation was. It comes back to protecting white identity and white power. And Christianity, white Christianity, especially Christian nationalism, is tied up into that. And while we saw it sort of in these kind of graphic ways a couple of weeks ago, this is not really anything new. And Elijah, as a historian, would be able to speak to this. But we've kind of, especially since we've seen this tight fusion of evangelical Christianity and conservative Republican politics, especially since the late 1970s, sort of ostensibly over the rallying cry of being anti-abortion or pro-life, which is, Elijah can even speak to, is an issue that was sort of strategically chosen by the kind of leaders of that group, though in actuality it was a strategy to protect whiteness, and especially to avoid sort of already long-delayed school integration. They just didn't think that was going to be as palatable and as kind of energizing as the issue of abortion. The point being that these groups in some form have been aligned for decades now. And we saw it even more explicitly with the Proud Boys in an article I read, praying to Jesus for a revival of their value systems, kind of invoking the sense of values that was there before they charged the Capitol. So there is this sense that both sort of white power and Christianity, or especially the kind of conservative Christianity, are under attack culturally. And so this is kind of victimized, resentful white supremacy that sees itself in a time of crisis, that it's losing this cultural control, scared of demographic changes, scared of what we saw in the Georgia runoffs, and exerting this sort of hidden and sinister and now explicit and graphic means of trying to maintain that power. So we see this motivated by fear, by resentment, and like I said, and this is sort of in no way novel, not to kind of be cheesy and invoke Martin Luther King on King Day, but he late in his life, he had a quote that said, white Americans seem to have declared that democracy is not worth having if it involves equality. And so I think we see here in its most raw form, the kind of willingness of some kind of aggrieved white Christians, their willingness to sacrifice democracy if it means kind of repelling, if that democracy means equality for everybody. And so I think we kind of see all these groups coming together, wanting to defend that, which in the end is kind of defending the sort of white Christian cultural political power scheme that's been going on for a while.
Elijah, I'm sure you want to hop in there. That seems like a lot up your alley.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that Chris, you've covered a lot of what I think is so interesting, right? If we want to look at this historically, part of the question, right, is where exactly do we begin from, right? Do we begin from the 1970s? And as you point out, right, that the modern day relationship between evangelical Christianity and republicanism is actually tied directly, right, to, like you said, this backlash to the civil rights movement. That in the 1960s, you have all of this progress or seeming progress, and you have this major switch, as you even know, Lauren, of Black people from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. And as a part of that transition to the Democratic Party, what then happens in the late 60s, beginning right with Richard Nixon, he makes this appeal to white people to say, look at what civil rights has caused this country, right? He shows the images of burning America, of destruction, of Black people rioting, right? And all of that is a part of the political ploy, right? To say, look, if you give Black people too much freedom, if you give them too much rights, the country will be destroyed. And that begins the modern day project, right, of appealing to the evangelicals, for tying it up to the anti-abortion struggle. But really, as Chris was saying, the anti-abortion struggle was a cover for their broader so-called religious liberty issues, and those so-called religious liberty issues were a broader cover for the fact that they didn't want their white kids to go to school with Black kids. So a bunch of these religious schools, so in my hometown, Baton Rouge, you see this around the mid-1970s, a bunch of religious schools open up, and it's their response to Brown versus Board of Education and their response to the progress of the civil rights movement. And then they make it about this one religious issue, right? When we really know it's a cover up for a racial issue. That's if we want to take the modern day approach. If we want to go back, right, to the 19th century or to the 18th century, right, I think we just have to remember that Christianity played a major role in undergirding slavery and undergirding the social and political hierarchy that existed in this country that placed white men at the top, and that it was the use of Christian theology, particularly texts like slaves obey your master, particularly texts like government come from God, so no one should challenge it. Those types of texts, right, were often preached to enslaved people so that they would remain in the hierarchy on the ground, right? And one of the things that I think that we know for sure, right, that always befuddles me is that when you have the Christianization of enslaved Africans here in America, one of the things that we know is that their Bible that they were given didn't include the book of Exodus, right? And so we think about this being a broader intentional strategy that you know the significance of the book of Exodus. You know what the book of Exodus is about, and then you start this process of Christianization and you intentionally exclude it because you know the point to liberation. And so for me, it shows this broader project that that Christianity, Christian institutions, Christian theology, Christian ministers, and everyday Christian people have been playing in undergirding and supporting white supremacy here. And so it's almost at any point in our history, right, we can see the significance of Christianity in the white supremacist world, right? I'll just say one other thing. Oh no, I'll stop there. There's more than I can say. But.
No, I think that's good. And I think what I'm hearing from you guys is like, they appear to be different factions, but they kind of all have the same roots, right? So like no matter what your particular brand of flavor is for being at the Capitol that day, it's kind of all rooted in this maintaining of white supremacy and white power, and the fear of what happens to our country if that crumbles, right? And we can't deny the role that the church has played in that, right? And that so much of the undertone in that is religious. And so I think that's a really powerful point that I do want to hone in on. I also think it's important to remember that like none of these, what's the word I would use? None, like this fear of what happens if we don't have white supremacy, right, is a weird admission to the notion that we're rooted in it, right? That like if you feel like America is so intertwined with white supremacy that like you don't recognize this country without it, that also speaks to the level with which the power that it must have here. And so I was wondering if there was any way we could drive that home too. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, and that makes me think of all the political shows and political commentary right after this happened, and political responses that were like, these are extremist groups. This is not America, right? And then I think we've all seen and kind of participated in some of the pushback there to say, this is kind of America from its origins, right? This is Jamestown. This is 1619. This is earlier than that, and kind of the territory that became Florida. This is how America was founded. This is its heritage. And to say that this is not America just whitewashes all of that. And so I think your point is really great, Lauren, that you can't really have America, especially in these people's minds, but also historically, you don't have America. You don't have this type of democracy without that history of America being founded on the premise of white supremacy and a kind of Christian white supremacy, because it was Christians who were engaged in the slave trade, who were coming over here, who were continuing to use it and justify it, employing those verses that Elijah was talking about from the very beginning. So in any attempt to distance ourselves, I just want to resist attempts to distance ourselves from that, and I'll talk about that some even later also. But especially in the calls to say this is not who America is, are really troubling and are not going to get us to the point to where we actually recognize and take responsibility, all of us, for what happened that day and what's continuing to happen.
Yeah, and I would just say, I think it's such an important point that you make, Chris, about this being who we are, right, as a country, who America is as a country. And I think that for many people, and I'm even curious as to how you think about this, because for many people, it's that tension, right? Is America its sort of worst and original nature, or is it its aspirations, its ambitions? One of the things that we recently discussed in a church and was the book Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, right, where he talks somewhat about what you're saying. He starts off by saying, here's what I would like you to know, that in America it is traditional to destroy the Black body. It is heritage, right? And he goes through this whole litany of how it was blood and beatings and whippings and the destruction of the Black body that, what he said, watered the first fruits of the American garden, right? And from his perspective, and I think from my perspective, right, we cannot overlook this origin. We cannot overlook this beginning to say, wait a second, you have to think about this. If Washington is a slaveholder, if Jefferson is a slaveholder, if Madison is a slaveholder, if all of the founders and the first presidents are slaveholders, that means that they are participating in the violence. There's no way that, even though we think of Washington as as this great man, this great figure, there's no way you maintain a plantation like Mount Vernon, right, and not do so violently, not do so in a way that is white supremacist, right? And so I think part of the challenge and part of the difficulty, Lauren, and since you're really the expert in this area, is part of the difficulty is, how do we get the general public to acknowledge the white supremacist origins, right? Because as a historian, it's clear to me that it was our plantation economy that made America rapidly develop quicker than many other nations. It was our participation in the slave trade. One of the things we know, and Americans like to pretend like this wasn't true, one of the things we know is that Americans were trading slaves on the continent of Africa. Because part of the discussion, right, is they want to say, no, we only bought. But we know that that's not true. That in fact, that many Americans went over to the continent of Africa and directly bought, directly participated in slave raids. And that's a part of our identity. That's a part of our story. That's a part of who we are.
Yeah, so it's funny you say that, because when Chris was making his comments and you were making yours, I thought about the issue years ago now, and it feels so like ridiculous now, but around the Confederate statues, right? And the Confederate flag. And it was this idea of heritage, not hate, right? Like, oh, this is our heritage. It's not that it's about hate. And I was like, actually, it's a heritage of hate, right? It's both. Like, it's yes, hate, and yes, heritage. And so, Elijah, when you were saying, like, there's this duality in America, like, are we our aspirations, or are we what we've done? We are both. We are both of those things, and we are all of those things. And so a lot of people want to cherry pick that, right? So the idea is that we don't want to account for that. We don't want to apologize for that. Honestly, when pushed, we don't even really want to feel shame about it. We just want to be this aspiration, this glossy picture, this land of liberty. And so, yeah, I think for me, step one of this is acknowledging, like, no element of the American identity or experience is exclusive. Like, we are not solely anything. We are all of it. And taking on all of that is something that's really important, I think, in order for us to move forward. And kind of as we're transitioning into hold up here, as far as like something that's not being discussed about the people who were at the Capitol, something I want to note that I think kind of undergirds a lot of this conversation, but isn't as much said. So media in this country lives on the coast overwhelmingly. Whether that's New York, Los Angeles, DC, maybe you got CNN in Atlanta, but short of that, media overwhelmingly is a coastal situation. So I think because of that, we have to take into mind what wealth looks like varies in different parts of the country. And I think there's an assumption that the South and Midwest are poor. And therein, these are poor people who are advocating for these, who feel this economic anxiety, and that's what's driving them to what looks like white supremacy. Absolutely not. Again, in down south, wealth doesn't always look like skyscrapers and penthouses and other things. But people who live on large plots of land are not poor. They're not. Maintaining land costs a lot of money. Being in industry costs a lot of money. A lot of the posts that I saw from friends and loved ones and backlash to the people who were at the Capitol, these people were business owners. People are boycotting their businesses now. People are losing clients. These were professional people who I think to write them off as economically anxious does everyone a disservice to understanding how deep the issue is and what the real problem is for the people who were there, right? And this is in addition to the fact that, like, as y'all know, staying in DC is not cheap, right? So these people found means to get to DC, stay for several days, and then had flights booked home, whether they actually came into fruition or not. And so I think that the idea that these people are poor or ignorant or uneducated, and that is what leads them to these conclusions, is inherently false. And I think that to continue to propagate that gives them way less credit than they deserve in the active attempt to overthrow our government that they participated in. So that's what I would like to say. I think it needs to be discussed. What about either of you?
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Lauren. I think that there were reports that Trump was kind of reveling in what was happening until he sort of saw the people and thought that they were low class, and he wanted to distance himself from that. It's okay for people to attack the Capitol as long as they're not low class people for him, which should speaks to a lot of things. But I think it's important to recognize a couple things. Not only that people who are actually participating in this were not just poor people who are kind of economically aggrieved, but also that the people who sort of undergirded this movement, who've been supporting it for 4 years and longer, who voted for Trump overwhelmingly, 4 years ago and this year, who maybe didn't kind of actively march on the Capitol, but were kind of sitting at home and enjoying what they were seeing, or maybe feeling a little uneasy, but had done things to help kind of unknowingly support in the first place, those are also people who are not motivated primarily out of economic concerns. I mean, so much data coming out now about the way that racial anxiety and the kind of changing of this country really motivated this. I mean, and one thing that I think has been sort of a bit underanalyzed, but it's important to think that this happened right after the first black senator from Georgia was elected, and not only just a black man from Georgia, but a black pastor representing kind of the best of the black church tradition. And so I just have to think that some of that, has to do with what we saw, and that it's no coincidence that this was part of it. Not only kind of Trump's speech, but a kind of larger sense of kind of racial anxiety and resentment that's going on.
Yeah, and I think the points that y'all are making are extremely strong, right? And I think that when I think about the things that we aren't talking about, and that I think that we have to deal with, right, historically and in our current political and social atmosphere, is this idea, right, that for many people, right, once they saw that the institution of slavery could not last forever, many powerful people in the 19th century believed that the United States should be a white nation, right? And so even you see the flag behind me is the flag of Liberia. Liberia, you can argue, right, is a nation that comes out of this idea that if Black folk will be free, they can't be free here, right? And those active debates were being had and taken by powerful people, by Henry Clay, who went on to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives, by Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, by Bushrod Washington, who was a Supreme Court justice and a nephew of George Washington, right? So these people and many others were actively, James Monroe went on to be the President of the United States. Many of these people were actively invested in the idea that this nation should stay white, right? And I think that as we dissect, right, what happens, and this is back to the point that both of y'all are making, what we have to deal with is the racial issue at the center of our country, right? And what we have to be willing to do is to say at some point we need to address this. Perhaps we need to address it constitutionally, right? I know we've had some ways of addressing constitutionally. We've ended slavery, we've done those sorts of things, but perhaps we need, and this is just an idea I'm thinking off the top of my head right here, perhaps we need a type of a constitutional amendment on our racial origins to say we recognize our problematic foundings and yet we seek, right, to do something different in light of that. The other thing quickly that I want to say that I don't think people are talking about specifically in regards to the attack, we talk about members of Congress, and Lauren, you and I talked about this briefly. We talk about members of Congress, and I'm glad that all of them were safe and all of the politicians were safe. But you know what I also think about? I think about all of the staffers, all of the people that look like me and you that are out here trying to chase their dreams to work for causes that they believe in. I think about all of the maintenance staff, the custodians, right? All of the ordinary people who work in the Capitol building every day, who are cleaning bathrooms and fixing lights and moving chairs and moving tables. And my question is, what was life like for them on that day? Many of those people had to be there. And I want us to pay more attention to those ordinary people who probably are Black and brown and who probably did not have security, did not have the top national security professionals looking after them. And I think part of why they come up for me is because in many ways, right, they are the laborers. They are the ordinary laborers who have to deal with the backlash, right, of this white rage. There was a picture, I think, that went viral of a Black janitor, right, sweeping up the glass that had been broken at the Capitol. And that image is frozen in my head. And I want us to talk more about those people, about the trauma and pain they experienced, and about their own relationship to this country.
Yeah, Lauren, I would just add to that and say the thing that I think has been most missing from this conversation. I think that's a great point, Elijah, about some of the sort of overlooked people who are active, in that day. I'll take another angle and say I think that one of the most kind of missing parts of the conversation are people who weren't actually active, participating in that this day, but helped support it. So I read one piece by a conservative columnist named David French, who condemned this as a sort of Christian insurrection, which I think was helpful. Did a couple of things that I didn't like, but he had a helpful distinction between activating lies and enabling lies. The activating lies for this being kind of election fraud, the QAnon conspiracies, that sort of thing, and the enabling lies being that like Biden's going to be hostile to the church, this kind of nascent sort of socialism idea that the church will suffer if Trump's not there to defend it, that sort of thing. And I think the same thing is true with white supremacy, and Elijah's kind of heard me talk about this some before, that they're activating and enabling narratives, and I think that this is often what's overlooked, that the kind of white Christian insurrection and even direct evangelical support for Trump is sort of the activating narrative, but moderate, even liberal, progressive white Christianity is part of the enabling narrative, whether this is kind of denying white Christianity's role in developing white supremacy back, in the kind of 1600s that contributed to the colonialism and slavery, or its central role in defending it even now, whether it's a kind of colorblind model, even some of its moderate to progressive models who are more eager to distance themselves from racism and thus kind of perpetuating it. I think there's a lot of enabling that happens there. And I don't want moderate or progressive Christians who are listening to this, who are watching what we see on TV and being able to say, oh, look, what those people are doing is so bad, without taking into account the kind of small, even unconscious ways that we participate in this. I'll give one example, and I've written about this in a few different places, but I mentioned that I was the pastor of a kind of rural Baptist church out in North Carolina. In this church, we were in a kind of blue collar area, and we actually had, we're sort of a multi-ethnic congregation, which was rare for that area in North Carolina. But the church leadership, which was overwhelmingly white, wanted to attract the kind of young professionals in the Research Triangle area of Raleigh. And by that, they meant the kind of young white families who had a little more money, who sort of to them seemed more reputable and that sort of thing. And they wanted to even move the location of the church to that area, which would have drastically changed the demographic of the church membership, made it almost fully white rather than kind of the like cool little experiment that we were doing there, getting people together from different sort of walks of life. As a young pastor right out of seminary, I didn't think about the racial undertones or even overtones of what they were saying. It didn't, I was uncomfortable with it just because it didn't seem necessary. But I didn't think about, the kind of what was driving this, because I was kind of ensconced in this sort of colorblind sense of Christianity. And so I think that that's a perfect example of the ways that even kind of well-meaning, these were not fundamentalists, these were somewhat conservative, but by no means, not even sort of evangelical Christians, but they were contributing to the sort of racial narratives, and even that idea is kind of the baseline that you wouldn't have what happened on January 6th if there weren't kind of moderate people and Christians who are doing the kinds of things that weren't kind of actively fighting racism, that were helping contribute to this. And I think that by focusing so much on what we saw on January 6th, which was indeed horrific, but it allows most of us to say, well, since I would never actually break into the Capitol, I'm not to blame. I bear no responsibility for what happened.
No, I definitely think that's right, Chris. I mean, for the record, even people who were there and were active participants have attempted to distance themselves at this point. But it's important to remember, right, how much of these things are a culmination. The closest thing I saw was people who were like, oh, Republicans gave people like, an explosive, an accelerant, and a fuse, and then backed away from the explosion, right? Like, oh no, I didn't want you to do that. Like, well, no, there were a lot of elements here that you directly contributed to the way that people perceive things, and I think that's what's going to be a lot of the long-term work to be done. One, because I think that certain Republicans, for political expediency, would rather just play into this narrative so you can get to your next seat, so you can get, to Senate or the president or whatever. But for a lot of these people, I'm thinking about like QAnon people in particular, it's almost cult-like. And so that extraction has to be handled with a lot of actual care and like fragility for these people, because it's not just the experience. It's not just like what you actually believe. It's the community that comes with that. It's the embarrassment and shame. Like all of this moving forward, assuming that there is a forward, really does have to take into account that a lot of the lies aren't just on the surface, they're beneath the surface as well. But keeping that in mind, we don't like coddle white supremacists. That's not what I'm asking for. But I do think that there is a way to say like this has to be handled with tact while also being invested in the accountability for the actions, and acknowledging that like if that for every lie that's on the surface, if there's 10 underneath it, there's, people out there who believe 80% of that and 70% of that. You've got to chip away at that all the way until the bottom. And so I definitely think we have a hard road ahead in dealing with that.
Mm-hmm.
And for both of you to be, trained as clergy, what does that look like as far as holding people in a way that keeps them accountable for their actions, but also deals with the severity of what was done?
Yeah, I can start. I think it's a hard question, right? Because I think that what you point to, Lauren, is that there's a real problem in this country, right? And part of what I think you even notice that what Republican lawmakers have to deal with is that their large part of their constituency are white supremacists. That's just a fact. And it seems like with a lot of churches and church leaders, large parts of their congregants and parishioners and constituency are white supremacists. And so I think it's important to at least acknowledge that, right? And I think part of this is what I think Chris was getting at earlier, that like it's so important to be able to say, no, this is who we are, because it at least begins in a healthier place to say, let's actually address the reality, right? And the reality is that 70 million people voted for someone who actively sought to do everything against how we think about this democracy. 70 million people voted for a white supremacist. And we have a lot of people who are our fellow citizens, who are our neighbors, who do not value our lives. So pastorally, I think many of us have to rely upon the prophetic tradition to say, what do you do when you see violence and injustice around you? I think we have to make it clear to say, look, the Christian tradition, the best of it, hopefully, the parts of it most rooted in Jesus's vision of love and justice and freedom, has to rely upon being a truth teller, in saying, look, even though all of our neighbors are like this isn't right. This isn't good. This isn't acceptable. This isn't the way forward. And we cannot run away from that. And I think that a big part of the problem in our society is that too many clergy are scared. Too many white clergy are scared to actually be in the religious tradition that they claim to be in. Too many of them are actually scared to speak prophetically against their own people about what maybe, I presume, they know to be true and good in their heart, unless we have an additional problem of them actually believing like those people and being white supremacists themselves, which then again, it just highlights the bigger problem that we have. But I think that part of what it means is that we can't be friends with everybody, and that we cannot let everything go, but that there has to be strong prophetic urgency and fire against those who would keep supporting ideas that are white supremacist.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. As a kind of white clergy member, white theologian, seminary professor, I think that a lot of this has to be conversations and work that white congregations, predominantly white congregations and white denominations and all have to do on our own. And I think a lot of that begins with practices of accountability, which we've sort of talked about, and you talked about, Lauren, on a kind of political congressional level, and kind of reevaluating some of the language that we use. So, and especially trying to do away with some of this distancing language that I hear. So even being able to point to the people who were there on January 6th and say, even though some of them were Christian, they were white supremacist Christian or white supremacist extremist Christian, which I think when we sort of use white supremacists in that kind of noun type way, it absolves us from also being embedded in that. And so I think talking about white supremacy as an ideology, as a practice of a kind of position, a standpoint from which to see the world that I'm involved in and in some ways actively participating in, rather than those are white supremacists or racists over there and I'm not. I think we need to kind of work on that. Another example would be I was on a call, kind of board leadership call this week with a kind of moderate white denomination, and we were talking about kind of white supremacy and race, and one of the like older members there said, I'd heard recently that while white people and white Christians like the language of reconciliation, Black Christians don't like that as much. And it was this kind of revelation there, which, glad people are kind of coming around to that, but I think, again, kind of purging ourselves of some of this language and kind of introducing new language and new ways of thinking, even on a language and kind of grammar level, can begin to change our conceptions and perceptions of things, as we then begin to police that and hold one another more accountable. I think of like the SBC recently that criticized critical race theory, and kind of immediately some kind of predominantly Black Southern Baptist churches and pastors like left the denomination. I mean, and so then, that's in some ways, it's a small step, right? But it's in some ways kind of holding leadership accountable. And if the SBC, which had just a few, Black congregations and members in the first place, loses all of them, then they have to kind of reevaluate and think like, what am I doing that I'm actually like kind of more homogenizing us rather than kind of expanding. So I think all of that are ways that within the kind of white community, we have to do a lot of work and have a lot of difficult conversations to begin to kind of move forward.
Absolutely. Somewhat taking us into our next segment called I Ain't Sorry. We can kick this off with Chris. We'll go back around. What's something you're unapologetic for in your work that you think is like, no matter what, is a hill worth dying on?
Yeah, look, I think in this conversation, I don't know that I want to like stake a claim to things that I don't want to apologize for. I think that the whole sort of thrust of, whatever small contribution I can make to this conversation is to talk about things that I and my fellow white Christians and theologians ought to be sorry for, right? And so I think that the things that I've talked about are things to be sorry for. And I think that again, our work is to go back and kind of look at our kind of Christian theological moral formation and see the ways that it's been tied with white supremacy. It has to have been, right? Like it's inevitable, as we talked about, to be white and Christian in America is going to be tied up in that. And a lot of those ways may not be directly obvious to us, on the surface. And so you have to really dig deep. And like you said, Lauren, to find the kind of 10 lies that are underlying the like surface lie that's there, right? And to look with that. And so I think that like, again, the kind of, when we think about the distinctions between the people who are at the Capitol, people who maybe went to Trump's rally but didn't march on the Capitol, those who voted for him, our friends and neighbors and church members who did, that these distinctions are kind of less significant than the kind of collective responsibility that we all have. And I think that we all have a kind of common Christian language that we employ and use in a lot of different ways, but we have ways of speaking to one another and doing this work of accountability that's there. And so I think that a lot more of that has to happen. And maybe if there's any good to come from a kind of such a graphic exposure of the connections of white supremacy and Trumpism or whatever, as we've seen like in the flags that you mentioned, Lauren, maybe that can spur some conversation to happen along those lines.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. I think for me, the two things that I'm unapologetic about right now is one, that that if white supremacy is not curtailed, we're all going to be killed. It's going to get all of us, right? And I think that's a part of the moral imperative for this group of people that you're talking about, Chris, for these white moderates, white liberals, even white conservatives who don't think that they're that bad, that we see that the biggest threat to our country, to our society, to our moral imagination, to our political infrastructure is white supremacy. That was true historically, and it's still true today. And I think I'm not going to quit sounding the alarm about it, right? I'm not going to quit sounding the alarm that white supremacy in all its forms is deadly and violent and horrific even for white people, right? And that the moral courage worth fighting against it matters much more than whatever backlash it can offer you, right? Maybe that's my Jesus tradition that I'm in, maybe that's the Black radical tradition that I'm in, but I think that things that are that bad have to be faced, and they have to be faced by people who take seriously how bad it is. And so I think that I'm not going to quit sounding the alarm about white supremacy, about white violence, about anti-Black racism, and about the many divergent aspects of that central ideology that is, like you said, Chris and Lauren, fully a part of who we are as a society, and not just on the fringes, right? You have at least 2 United States senators. You have the sitting president today, right, who endorses this. This isn't fringe, this is mainstream, right? And so I'm going to keep sounding the alarm about how mainstream it is, because unless we actually do what we need to do to move it to the fringes, it will only become more of a problem for all of us. The other thing that I'm unapologetic about is lifting up the voices of Black people, Black women, Black radicals, Black queer people who have been sounding the alarm for centuries. To say that we aren't the first ones to do this, we aren't the first ones to notice this is a problem. But from the inception of this place, from when some of the first Black people set foot on the soil, they were sounding the alarm with whatever tools and methods and resources that they had, and we are only acting in that tradition.
This is the thing that I appreciate about your ministry and theology, Elijah, is the kind of, and your work, Lauren, and of this podcast is kind of the unrelenting nature of the critique that you continue to point us toward, Elijah. I mean, because it's necessary, and it's the only thing that'll move us, forward. I think about, we've often, and on this day in particular, people point to the writings of King, and one of his most famous writings, the letter from a Birmingham jail. We note that it was written to white moderates around that time, and white moderates and progressives today can look and say, yeah, look at those white moderates that were not active. They weren't doing what he wanted to way back then. Man, shame on them, without kind of looking at our own self-reflective work. And so it takes people, prophets and theologians and activists like you guys to help and kind of continually remind white America and Christianity that, we still have a lot of work to do. And so I appreciate that.
I appreciate your appreciation, Chris. And I mean, as far as things that I'm unapologetic about, similarly to Elijah, I think it's important to note that there were people who from, June 2015 said, this is a white supremacist campaign, and Donald Trump has a history of being a white supremacist. We had Central Park 5, we had the housing issues that he had in New York, we knew the family that he came from, we knew the way he treated women, the way he referenced people from the moment that he announced he was running. And so it is all the way down to his obsession with Obama and beating him at every turn, right? There's this very real idea that, similarly, actually, what you said too, Chris, about this is not who we are. when people said from the beginning, this was who we are. I point out to Republicans all the time, 17 other options were had in that Republican primary. The primary of 2016, the Republican primary of 2016 looked like the Democratic primary of 2020, as in you had so many other options. And from debate one all the way through, like Donald Trump was the highest polling candidate. And so we can't take that lightly as like, oh, we were forced, or oh, it was some like political fluke. Like, no, you had a lot of other options, and this was who power consolidated behind. Noting from that, you have like there's 4 years of terror of people saying that that he was inciting violence, that his supporters were emboldened, that there was a chance that this could end terribly. All the way up through, once it became pretty clear, honestly, fairly early on, that he wasn't going to win, and his refusal to concede and everything that came with that. I guess I want to say that January 6th, the day itself, should have been predicted on everyone's radar, if for no other reason than like this is what he's been building to since he stepped on the scene. And I don't think we can miss that, because I think that there's this idea that like every time something happens that people of color predicted for X amount of however, there's this like, oh yeah, that's what we should listen to people of color, and then like don't. It's like, oh my gosh, listen to Black women, oh my gosh, listen to queer people, oh my gosh, listen to immigrants, and then there's a vacuum where that just does not occur. And so we end up in this cycle where I'm like, no, it's important to note that again here, because you have to realize this will show back up. Like I don't think by any means we've heard the last of these people. And honestly, if we're gonna just to go ahead and transition us into my last point, or our drunken love segment, and I'll go ahead and go first, just to give people time to think. I think that it's not to be overlooked that the levels of government to which the actions on January 6th went up to. So like something that I'm never going to I guess be that like will always fathom me is this notion that after Donald Trump lost the election and the results were certified, he started moving people around the Department of Defense. Right. He started moving people around the Pentagon and uninstalling military personnel and putting in Trump loyalists. And everyone was saying, well, why is he doing that? Well, that's weird. You're sitting back, what's going on? And then, he's tweeting all his madness that comes from his Twitter account. Like, so yeah, we had the actual January 6th tweet, but then for Metro Police to be calling for distress from Department of Defense, for like the National Guard to have their long delay in showing up, like all of that to me says that this conspiracy went to the highest levels of government, if not came from the highest levels and trickled down. Like this goes all the way up to the Department of Defense. Even yesterday, I think it came out, which would be the 17th, that the National Guard, the Department of Defense, is concerned about there being a coup on the 20th from inside the National Guard, right? They're like, oh, we need to vet these officers. And I'm like, okay, that's a great thought. Now that you've got 25,000 of them in the city, you're like, good luck vetting them in 3 days. But there is this very real, or there needs to be this very real acknowledgement that this was, again, more than just who actually stormed the Capitol that day. This was very much planned. And we need while Democrats have Congress, we need to make sure we do the rigorous committee hearings and investigating and unearthing of all of what happened, because I still think we're at the tip of the iceberg, honestly. And so that would be my like drunken love segment. Elijah, what about you?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that, because I think, Lauren, I think that's so important. And I think this goes back to the problem, right, of white supremacy, right? We realize a large portion of the constituency is white supremacists, and a large portion of even the people that are supposed to protect and defend us from this. It shows that we have real problems in this country that we have to begin the process of addressing. One of the things that I wanted to say, to point out, right, that my congregation, I've recommended it to a lot of our friends too, that Chris has written a helpful book on white supremacy. I don't know why the title of your book is slipping my mind right now.
Witnessing Whiteness. Witnessing
Whiteness. There we go. And I think that that book has helped me a lot over the course of the year to deal with some of the theological and historical origins, and I'll let Chris talk more about that. Another thing, the thing that I'm super drunk in love about right now is revisiting the work of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, I think is our most profound poet, truth teller, right? And so Eddie Glaude just wrote a book on James Baldwin called Begin Again, which the book was written during this summer or for this summer. And it was before we knew the outcome of the election, but it's all about grappling with the Trump era. And the quote that the book is built around from James Baldwin comes out at the end of the collapse of the civil rights movement. Again, Baldwin was friends with Martin Luther King. He was friends with Malcolm X. He was friends with Medgar Evers. He was living in Paris during the height of the civil rights movement. But after seeing the images, so many of the images of Black folk getting beat, he is a gay Black man who was escaping the further violence, right, of America, decided that he had to come back to participate in the civil rights movement. So he ended up forming all of these relationships with all of the primary civil rights leaders across the country, including Stokely Carmichael and Diane Nash. And so as the movement itself is collapsing, he writes these words that I think are so helpful. He says, not everything is lost. Responsibility cannot be lost. It can only be abdicated. And if one refuses abdication, one can begin again, right? And so I think about James Baldwin's words, right? That even when things are the darkest, right? Even when it feels like everything is lost, that we still have a responsibility to one another. We still have a responsibility to struggle against injustice, to struggle against white supremacy. And if we remember that responsibility, then we can begin again. So the thing that I'm drunk in love with right now is the idea that James Baldwin is pushing us to begin again as a country, as a society, as a democracy, as a people.
Sounds good, Chris. Bring us home.
Yeah, I love the Baldwin shout out. I'd recommend reading anything that he's written for this time. Thanks for the book plug, Elijah. I will say I think it dovetails nicely into what you're saying, in that the whole point and argument of the book is to say that white American Christianity has been so complicit for so long in white supremacy that we our only option is to move from sort of language of reconciliation and all to language of responsibility, to really recognize the kind of hidden and implicit ways that we've been embroiled in white supremacy, and to do the work to uncover that, and then proposing some practices for white Christians to take responsibility for that. And that in some ways kind of leads to my rant. Mine is on the kind of prevalence of whataboutism and false equivalences that we see. I mean, this began right after the events in Charlottesville in the summer of 2017 when I was there, and witnessed what happened on the ground, and got back to DC that night to see Trump say that they were good people on both sides. And as much as I didn't like Trump, even during the campaign and becoming president, to kind of see him sort of bold-faced lie about something that I witnessed with my own eyes when I was there. But that sort of false equivalence, I think, in the kind of whataboutism has been a kind of marker, I think, of the last few years, and certainly of his sort of supporters. And so, again, we saw that this week with people, seeing the attack on the Capitol and saying, yeah, I condemn violence in all forms. Look at that attack on the Capitol. But what about the violence that we saw in the protests this summer, and the Black Lives Matter protests? To see the kind of to see a sort of false equivalence between both the kind of levels of violence and danger that was there, as well as the grievances. That there's no equivalence between the grievances that spurred those events, the history and kind of continued expression of explicit and systemic oppression of African Americans makes whatever current conservative Christian complaints, it just makes them look like spoiled toddlers who are just fearful of losing the kind of power that we've possessed and had for such a long time. And so and we see this again from explicit Trump supporters, but we also see this in more moderate forms, again, among kind of moderate and even progressive politicians and Christians who are jumping so quickly to call us for unity and harmony, that I think are overlooking some of this work. And so I want to, a challenge to all of us is to, especially to kind of moderate white Christians, is not to jump to the kind of condemning all violence, kind of blanket statements without doing the work and highlighting the kind of discrepancy in the levels of kind of oppression and grievance that are there, and to not do anything that can fuel some of these kind of false equivalents that have been going on. So that just is something that really is a sort of a pet peeve of mine, that I would would constitute my rant for what I've been annoyed by over the last week or so.
I think that's a really good one. I definitely think that the false equivalencies have been in abundance and are still false. Like it's egregious. But Chris and Elijah, this has been such a great conversation. I'm so glad y'all were here and spent your time with me today. In the event, Chris, someone wants to reach out to you and probe further, or wants to know where they can learn more, where would you recommend they find you?
You can find me on Facebook and friend me there. You can find my book, Witnessing Whiteness, on Amazon or any local bookstore. Or you can find me on Twitter, which I occasionally post to, which I think is at KM_Norris, but it shows you how much I participate on Twitter that I don't quite even know my handle.
Good to know. How about you, Elijah?
Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. My name is Elijah Zehyoue. You can find me on Twitter at Elijah Z or the Book of Eli as well. So.
Okay. In that case, thank you both for being here. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. You just listened to this episode of Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered. If you're looking for me, you can find me at Lauren Zehyoue on Instagram and Twitter. And in the event you're looking for the show, you can find us at Unbossed, Unbothered, and Unfiltered on Instagram and Twitter as well. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you soon.